The rain hammered against the windshield, each drop a percussive beat against the blare of sirens. Michael's hands were steady on the wheel, his focus absolute, his mind cataloging every variable in a real-time risk assessment. The target vehicle, a nondescript white van, was 3 cars ahead, weaving through rush hour traffic with a recklessness that told him the driver was panicking. From his earpiece, a voice barked, "Chief, you're the only one with eyes on the package. Do you have a clear line of sight?" "Affirmative," Michael said, his voice as calm and flat as the gray sky. He was in the zone, a state of calculated chaos that had defined his career as a federal chief for the better part of 2 decades. He was the one who called the shots, the one who navigated the intricate lines between domestic and international threats, the one whose very presence could turn a high-stakes pursuit into a quiet, almost surgical, conclusion 1 hour later. The adrenaline had long since drained, replaced by the familiar, heavy fatigue that settled into his bones. Michael pulled off the main highway, the world shrinking from the chaotic grid of a major city to the quiet, tree-lined lanes of his suburban cul-de-sac. The air here smelled of freshly cut grass and summer rain, a stark and welcome contrast to the metallic tang of exhaust and urban grime. He steered his car, a temporary government-issued sedan, into his driveway. This was the source of all the trouble. It wasn't the sleek, armored SUV he usually drove on assignments. Instead, it was a perfectly ordinary-looking black Chevrolet Impala, a ghost car meant to blend in with the civilian fleet. But to the discerning eye, it had subtle differences, slightly darker window tints, a more complex antenna on the roof, and a license plate that was part of a specific federal sequence. To anyone else, it was just a car. To his neighbor, Brenda, it was a crime against the aesthetic order of their meticulously planned neighborhood. Brenda, the undisputed president of the Homeowners Association, was the high priestess of perfect lawns and immaculate driveways. She saw the world not as a place of people, but as a series of rules to be enforced, and she wielded her clipboard and laminated bylaws like weapons. Michael had already seen her peering out her living room window. With the scrutiny usually reserved for forensic investigators, she'd probably already looked up the car's make, model, and year, and was now building a mental case against its presence on her street. Michael simply sighed and went inside. He knew the drill. The car wasn't a violation. He had a permit from the HOA to park a government vehicle temporarily. He'd filed the paperwork weeks ago, but Brenda didn't care for paperwork. She cared for power. He was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, when the first siren wailed faintly in the distance. He paused, his hand halfway to the glass. It grew louder, a rising crescendo of sound that felt jarring and out of place in their peaceful neighborhood. He walked to the front window, drawing back a corner of the curtain. There they were. 2 squad cars, their red and blue lights flashing in a hypnotic, frantic rhythm. They slowed to a halt right in front of his driveway. As he watched, a familiar figure emerged from her front door, a triumphant smirk on her face. Brenda was on her porch, pointing directly at his car with an exaggerated theatrical flourish, as if she was announcing a great and terrible discovery. She had done it. She had called the cops for his car. He was a federal chief. Michael opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch with a deliberate, unhurried pace. The flashing red and blue lights painted the manicured lawn in an unsettling, pulsing glow. The 2 officers, a younger one with a nervous look and a senior one with a tired, knowing expression, were already speaking to Brenda. Her voice, usually a shrill whisper of neighborhood gossip, was now a loud, indignant roar. "That's the car. It's been there for days. A clear violation of Article 5, Section B, Subsection 2 of our bylaws regarding long-term guest vehicle parking. It's an eyesore, officer," she shrieked, pointing at the black sedan as if it were a biohazard. The older officer, his gaze scanning Michael's calm face, held up a hand to quiet Brenda. "Ma'am, we're here to speak with the owner." He addressed Michael, his tone professional and wary. "Sir, can you explain the nature of this vehicle?" "Yes, officer," Michael replied, his voice a low, steady baritone that instantly commanded attention. He made sure to keep his hands visible, moving slowly as if a hostile subject was in front of him. I'm the occupant of this residence. This is a temporary government vehicle. I have the necessary credentials and permits. He pulled out a leather wallet, not the one with his personal ID, but the one he carried in the field. He opened it to a specific page, showing the officer his federal identification badge and a laminated authorization card. The senior officer's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he registered the seal and the title on the badge. He gave a sharp, discreet nod to his partner. In the high-stakes world Michael inhabited, this silent exchange was a complete conversation. The partner understood immediately. This is not a parking dispute. Thank you, Chief, the senior officer said, the honorific, delivered with a sudden and genuine respect. Our apologies for the disturbance. We'll be on our way. Brenda's face, a second ago flushed with a self-righteous glow, went ashen. What, Chief? What about the bylaws? This is a clear violation. You can't just leave, she sputtered, her voice cracking with disbelief. The officer looked at her, his expression now one of mild exasperation. Ma'am, this vehicle is authorized. It's part of a federal operation. Our jurisdiction ends right here. He gave a curt nod to Michael, who returned it with a silent, appreciative glance. As the officers got back into their squad cars and the flashing lights receded down the street, an eerie silence settled over the cold dash-to-dash sack. Only Brenda remained, her shoulders stiff, her lips a thin, furious line. She stood at the edge of the driveway, glaring at Michael. So, you think you can just flash some badge and be above the rules, do you? Michael took a slow breath, deciding against his usual tactic of professional silence. Instead, he approached her, using the skills he'd honed in a dozen different countries. He wasn't negotiating a hostage situation, but the fundamentals were the same. Brenda, he began, his voice soft and empathetic, this isn't a parking issue. This is about control. Why is it so important to you to have absolute power over this street? Her jaw tightened. It's not about power. It's about order. And people like you, who think they're so important, who think the rules don't apply to them, you ruin it for everyone. He saw the lie in her eyes, the way she clutched her clipboard as if it were a shield. He saw the projection. This wasn't about the car. It was about the authority it represented. He continued, pressing his point with the gentle but firm psychological pressure he'd used to break down the walls of hardened criminals. Is this about the order? Or is it about the fact that you feel you have no order in your own life? That you've lost control somewhere else and you're trying to reclaim it here? One rule at a time, his words, meant to be an honest exploration, landed like a punch. Brenda's face crumpled, not with sadness, but with pure, unadulterated rage. How dare you? You have no idea who I am. You think you're so smart, so important with your government car and your fancy title. You're nothing but a bully, she screamed, the last word echoing down the street before she spun on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Michael stood there for a moment, the silence now deafening. He hadn't broken her, but he had hit a nerve. He realized then that this wasn't a simple HOA dispute. Brenda's reaction was too intense, too personal. It wasn't about a car. It was a deeply rooted, psychological wound that was now manifesting as an obsession with neighborhood rules. Something in her past had led her to this moment. His professional curiosity, a force as powerful as any of his official directives, was now fully engaged. This was a puzzle, a human puzzle. He went back inside, his mind already working through the angles. The HOA database, public records, professional affiliations. He had access to resources that went far beyond what a normal neighbor would. This wasn't about revenge, but about a need to understand. He was going to find out what had happened to Brenda make her this way. This was no longer a personal feud. It was a federal case of curiosity. Michael's home office was his sanctuary, a place where he could analyze data and connect disparate threads of information in perfect silence. Late that night, with the street lights casting long shadows across his desk, he began his investigation. He wasn't using official government resources for a personal matter, but his skills and the tools available to him were far more advanced than a simple Google search. He started with public records and open-source data, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. The results began to paint a picture, not of a simple suburban tyrant, but of a woman who had once been in a position of significant power. Brenda was her name, but that wasn't always her identity. Before her marriage, she was known as Brenda Hayes, a mid-level manager in the Office of Domestic Preparedness. The office was a federal agency dedicated to disaster response and emergency management. Michael knew it well. It was the very same agency his department had a standing liaison with for all joint operations involving local infrastructure. He dug deeper, filtering through years of professional history. Her career had been solid, even impressive, until a specific point in time, a major, citywide power grid failure 3 years ago. The public record was vague, citing management oversight and a restructuring of departmental roles, but Michael, a master of reading between the lines of bureaucratic language, saw the truth. Brenda was at the center of the failure. She had been responsible for a procedural snafu that led to a 2-day blackout, costing the city millions and leaving citizens in the dark. It wasn't a criminal act, but it was a catastrophic professional failure. The investigation revealed that she had been demoted, transferred, and then eventually left the agency altogether. The thematic significance hit Michael with a powerful, almost absurd irony. Brenda had been in charge of managing chaos and preventing systemic failure on a massive scale. She had lost that control entirely, and now she was trying to reclaim it, not on a city-wide grid, but on a 50-foot stretch of curb, and not over power lines, but over a single, temporary vehicle. The very thing she was trying to regulate, a government car, was a direct, painful reminder of the world she had been exiled from. She wasn't just obsessed with rules. She was obsessed with rules that were a distorted reflection of the authority she had lost. Michael leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating his face. He had the full picture now. Brenda wasn't his enemy. She was a casualty of a system she had failed to control, a person so consumed by her past that she was turning her present into a replica of her old job, only on a much, much smaller scale. Her petty actions weren't born of malice, but of a desperate, suffocating need to be in charge of something, anything. His government car, a symbol of the very order and authority she had lost, was simply the last straw. He closed the laptop, a quiet plan forming in his mind. He could go to the police and have her charged with harassment. He could speak to the HOA board and have her removed from her post, but that wasn't his style. That would be treating a complex human problem like a simple violation, and that was exactly what Brenda had done. He had a different plan, one that would use his skills not for destruction, but for a resolution that was both professional and deeply personal. He would beat her at her own game, not by overpowering her, but by outsmarting her. He had all the information he needed to handle the situation, but he wouldn't use it to punish her. He would use it to end the conflict for good. The air in the community hall was thick with a humid, unspoken tension. The monthly HOA meeting, usually a mundane affair of budget reports and landscaping updates, had become a public arena. Residents sat on folding chairs, whispering and stealing glances toward the front table where Brenda, dressed in a crisp blazer, held court. Michael was seated in the third row, his presence a deliberate choice to be seen and not hidden. Brenda called the meeting to order, her voice resonating with an exaggerated authority. After dispensing with the pleasantries, she arrived at the main event. "Now, I'd like to bring up an ongoing issue that affects the very integrity of our bylaws," she announced, her eyes locking onto Michael's. The unauthorized vehicle on the property of a new resident, a black Chevrolet sedan. I believe we have a serious violation on our hands. A low murmur rippled through the room. Brenda, sensing her moment of triumph, continued, "Despite my repeated warnings, and even after calling local law enforcement, who, I might add, were surprisingly unhelpful, the vehicle remains. This is a clear sign of disrespect for our community's rules and for my authority as your elected president." She was using the situation to rally the neighbors, painting Michael as a rogue outsider who thought he was above the law. She even had a laminated printout of the car and the relevant bylaw section to pass around. This was her closing argument, her final play. As the murmurs grew louder, Michael raised his hand. Brenda's smile tightened. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said, using his last name with a cold formality. "I'd like to speak," he said, standing up. His posture was straight, his voice calm and firm. "First, I want to apologize for any inconvenience my temporary vehicle has caused. The license and plates are federal property, and as the bylaws permit, I have the necessary forms. I believe you have copies." Brenda scoffed. "Forms? We're talking about a rule violation, not bureaucracy. This is about trust." "It is about trust," Michael agreed, his tone becoming gentler, but with a new edge of purpose. "It's about trusting your elected leaders to act in the best interest of the community. It's also about understanding the pressures people are under." He looked directly at her, his eyes holding hers. "You've worked a high-stress job before, Brenda. You know what it's like when things go wrong, and you're the one held responsible." A flicker of panic crossed Brenda's face, a private moment of fear that only Michael saw. The room, however, was now completely silent, their attention fixed on the exchange. They had no context for his words, but the shift in his tone from formal to personal was jarring. Michael continued, his voice low enough that it compelled the room to lean forward. "You once worked in an office where every detail mattered, where a single error could have massive consequences for an entire city. You know what it feels like to lose control, and you know what it's like when the public doesn't understand the full story." Brenda's composure was crumbling. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles turned white. "You do, Brenda," Michael said, his voice now a quiet, powerful force. "And so does a community that was left without power for 2 days because of a procedural oversight. A mistake that wasn't just yours, but the entire system's. But you were the one who had to take the fall. That must have been a very heavy burden to carry. A burden that makes a small car in a cul-de-sac seem like a problem you can finally control." The words landed not as an accusation, but as an explanation. The neighbors looked at Brenda, then at each other. They didn't know the specifics of a citywide blackout, but they understood the idea of taking a hit for a greater corporate failure. They saw the shift in her rigid posture, the way she was now visibly shaking. Michael hadn't exposed her to humiliate her, but to give context to her behavior. He had treated her not as an enemy, but as a person, and in doing so, he had taken all the power from her public performance. "This isn't about my car," Michael concluded, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "This is about a community that should be supporting each other, not calling the police on our neighbors over petty issues. We're better than this." A man in the back row stood up and started to clap. Others followed, a slow, tentative applause that grew into a steady wave of approval. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Brenda was no longer their leader. She was just a neighbor who had been hurt by something they now, partially, understood. Michael had won not by fighting, but by a masterful display of professional empathy. The meeting, and the conflict, was over. The following week, the neighborhood felt different. The tension that had been a constant, low-grade hum had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of communal relief. Michael watched from his window a couple of his neighbors, people he'd only exchanged polite nods with before, pause to chat with him as they retrieved their mail. The black sedan remained in the driveway for a few more days, a silent monument to the bizarre confrontation, before being swapped out for his personal car. The day after the meeting, a terse, one-sentence email was sent to the community. Brenda has decided to step down as HOA president for personal reasons. The resignation was accepted with a quiet efficiency that seemed to be a new rule in itself. A new, far more relaxed, president was elected a week later, and the old laminated bylaws disappeared from the public notice board. The community had seen the human cost of unyielding authority, and they were ready for a new chapter. 2 months later, Michael was out on his lawn, tinkering with his grill, when he heard a familiar voice call his name. He looked up to see Brenda, standing at the end of his driveway. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She was holding a small, covered dish. "Brenda," Michael said, genuinely surprised. She shuffled her feet, looking down at the ground. I made too much lasagna. I thought you might like some." Her voice was soft, hesitant, a stark contrast to the piercing tone he had become used to. Michael walked over, a small smile on his face. "Thank you, Brenda. That's very kind of you." He took the dish, their fingers brushing for a moment. The contact was brief, but it held a strange, unexpected weight. "I just wanted to say," she began, her gaze finally meeting his, "you were right about everything. I was so used to having control, and when I lost it, I couldn't handle it. I've been so angry for so long." "It wasn't about the car. It was never about the car." Michael nodded. "I know. It was about losing something important to you." She looked at him with a new kind of vulnerability. "Yes. I've been going to a therapist. I'm learning that it's okay not to be in charge of everything. I'm learning that my value isn't tied to a title or a set of rules." The new dynamic between them was not one of victor and vanquished, but of two people who had found a common understanding. Michael, the federal chief who dealt with global crises, had found a local, human lesson in his own backyard. Brenda, the self-proclaimed empress of the cul-de-sac, had found a path toward healing after being stripped of her self-imposed power. The story of Karen called cops for my car wasn't just a tale of a petty dispute. It was an exploration of how people cope with the loss of power and the meaning of true authority. Michael's power came from his quiet competence and his ability to see beyond the surface, to understand the human motivations behind the rules. Brenda's power had come from a desperate need to control, a need that ultimately made her lose the respect she so desperately craved. In the end, it wasn't about who had the bigger title, the louder voice, or the more powerful friends. It was about who understood the true nature of the battle. The car was just the beginning. The real conflict was a quiet, private war, and both of them, in their own way, had finally found peace.